Right now, as you're watching this, your body is covered in roughly 5 million hair follicles. That number isn't a guess. It's close to the same number a chimpanzee has. A gorilla has it too. So does an orangutan. In fact, almost every mammal on Earth, humans included, has a strikingly similar density of hair follicles packed across their skin. The difference isn't how many we have. It's what's actually growing out of them. On a chimpanzee, those follicles produce thick, dark, visible hair across almost the entire body. On you, they mostly produce something called vellus hair, fine, pale, nearly invisible strands so short and thin they barely register as hair at all. Structurally, we are just as hairy as our closest primate relatives. We just switched off the part of the system that makes that hair grow long and thick almost everywhere except a few very specific places. That's the real mystery hiding inside a question that sounds almost too simple to ask. Why did evolution, after millions of years of keeping our ancestors covered in fur, suddenly decide the human body didn't need it anymore? And here's what makes this genuinely strange from an evolutionary standpoint. Losing your fur is not a small, low-stakes decision for a mammal to make. Fur protects against sunburn. It regulates temperature at night. It shields skin from scrapes, thorns, insect bites, and the elements. For an animal moving through the African savanna, hairlessness looks, on paper, like it should be a liability, not an advantage. Which means something happened to our ancestors that made naked skin worth the trade-off. Something powerful enough to override millions of years of mammalian design. To understand what that something was, we actually have to start somewhere unexpected. Not with fossils. With lice. Human head lice and human body lice are, genetically speaking, nearly identical species, but they live in very different places. Head lice cling to hair on the scalp. Body lice, on the other hand, live specifically in clothing, laying their eggs in the seams and fibers of fabric rather than directly on skin. And that distinction turns out to be scientifically enormous, because body lice could not have existed as a distinct population until humans were actually wearing clothes. By comparing the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice, researchers have been able to estimate roughly when clothing entered the picture for early humans. And the numbers that come back are consistently somewhere in the range of 170,000 years ago, give or take. Which means, by extension, that human skin had already become exposed enough, hairless enough, that our ancestors needed to invent an artificial replacement for fur in order to survive cold nights. You don't invent clothing to protect fur. You invent it to protect skin that's no longer protected by anything else. That's one thread of evidence. Here's another, and it comes from a completely different direction entirely. Skin pigmentation. Human skin color is controlled significantly by a gene called MC1R, which regulates the production of melanin. And by studying the specific mutations in that gene across different human populations, geneticists have been able to estimate roughly when dark, heavily pigmented skin first evolved in early humans, somewhere in the range of 1.2 million years ago. That number matters enormously here, because dark melanin-rich skin only becomes evolutionarily necessary once skin is actually exposed to direct, unfiltered sunlight on a daily basis. A heavily furred body doesn't need dramatically pigmented skin underneath, because the fur itself is doing the sun protection. The moment our ancestors started needing serious pigmentation to prevent skin damage from ultraviolet radiation is very likely the same rough window when the fur covering that skin had already substantially thinned out. So here we have two independent genetic clocks, one built from lice, one built from skin pigmentation genes, both quietly pointing toward the same conclusion from two completely unrelated directions. Somewhere between roughly 1 million and 2 million years ago, long before modern Homo sapiens even existed, our ancestors were already losing their fur. And that timing is not a coincidence. Because that exact window lines up almost perfectly with one of the most important physical transformations in the entire human evolutionary story: the emergence of Homo erectus. Homo erectus looked strikingly different from the hominins that came before it. Longer legs. A more efficient upright stride. A skeleton clearly built for covering serious distance on foot. And that shift in body design points directly toward what remains the leading scientific explanation for why our ancestors lost their hair in the first place. Running. Not sprinting. Endurance running. Specifically, a hunting strategy researchers call persistence hunting, where early humans would chase prey animals not by outrunning them in a burst of speed, but by simply refusing to stop. Antelope and other savanna animals are far faster than humans over short distances. But they cool themselves primarily through panting, and panting only works efficiently while they're not actively sprinting. A human pursuer, moving at a steady, relentless jog for hours under the African sun, can force prey into a brutal, unsustainable cycle. Run, overheat, stop to pant and cool down, get caught up to again, run again. Eventually, the animal's own body temperature becomes the thing that defeats it, not the hunter's speed. But there's a catch, and it's the exact catch that explains our hairlessness. Running that long in that heat generates a massive amount of internal metabolic heat. And fur, no matter how useful it is at night or in cooler climates, becomes a serious liability the moment an animal needs to dump large amounts of heat quickly while moving under direct sunlight. Humans solve this problem through a cooling system that is, frankly, unusual among mammals. We sweat. Not the way a horse sweats, a relatively modest secondary system. Humans have somewhere between 2 and 4 million sweat glands distributed across nearly the entire surface of the skin, an eccrine sweat system so extensive and so efficient that we are, pound for pound, one of the best heat-dumping mammals on the entire planet. A horse can outrun a human easily over 500 meters. Over 26 miles, in serious heat, a trained human can genuinely beat a horse. That's not a myth. It's been demonstrated in actual endurance races. But that sweat system only works if the sweat can actually reach the surface of the skin and evaporate freely into the air. And thick fur gets directly in the way of that process. Fur traps a layer of humid saturated air right against the skin, badly reducing evaporative cooling exactly when an overheating body needs it most. For an animal built to run prey to exhaustion under the equatorial sun for hours at a time, a coat of dense fur isn't a helpful accessory. It's actively working against the entire survival strategy. So the leading scientific theory goes like this. As early Homo erectus increasingly relied on long-distance endurance hunting and scavenging across the hot, exposed savanna, individuals with slightly less body hair would have been able to cool down faster, hunt longer, cover more ground, and survive heat stress that could genuinely kill a still furry competitor. Over enormous stretches of evolutionary time, that advantage compounded, generation after generation quietly favoring less hair and more sweat glands, until the trait became the new baseline for the entire population. This also explains something that might otherwise seem strange. If losing body hair was the advantage, why did we keep hair on our heads? The answer connects directly back to the same thermoregulation story. A dense layer of hair specifically on top of the skull serves a very different purpose than body fur. It shields the brain, arguably the single most heat-sensitive and metabolically expensive organ in the entire human body, from direct prolonged sun exposure during exactly the kind of long midday exertion persistence hunting required. Lose fur everywhere else to cool the body efficiently. Keep it specifically where it protects the brain from literally cooking under direct sunlight. That's not contradictory. That's the same underlying selective pressure solving two different problems in two different locations on the same body. Now, thermoregulation is the leading theory, and it's the one with the strongest, most consistent physical and genetic evidence supporting it. But it isn't the only theory researchers have seriously proposed, and a good documentary owes you the honest picture rather than pretending the science is fully settled with zero debate. One competing idea focuses not on heat, but on parasites. Thick body fur, especially in a warm climate, makes an excellent home for ticks, fleas, lice, and other external parasites, some of which can carry serious, potentially fatal disease. Under this theory, less hairy individuals may have simply suffered fewer parasite infestations and therefore fewer parasite-driven illnesses, giving them a modest but real survival advantage entirely separate from the running and sweating explanation. It's a genuinely reasonable hypothesis, and it likely wasn't operating in complete isolation from thermoregulation. The two pressures could easily have reinforced each other rather than competing for a single explanation. Another proposed explanation leans toward sexual selection, the idea that hairlessness, once it appeared, may have simply become attractive to potential mates for reasons disconnected from pure survival value, similar to how a peacock's tail persists despite being metabolically expensive and practically inconvenient. Under this model, smoother skin might have signaled youth, health, or the absence of visible parasites and skin disease, making hairless individuals more successful at finding mates and passing on their genes, regardless of whether the trait offered any direct running or hunting advantage at all. There's also a considerably more speculative theory known as the aquatic ape hypothesis, which proposes that an early hominin ancestor spent a meaningful stretch of evolutionary time in a semi-aquatic environment, wading and foraging near rivers, lakes, or coastlines, where reduced body hair would have offered less water resistance while swimming. It's an idea that gets significant public attention because it's genuinely fun to think about, but it's worth being direct here. This hypothesis has never gained meaningful support within mainstream paleoanthropology, and it lacks the kind of consistent fossil, genetic, or anatomical evidence that supports the thermoregulation model. Most researchers in the field consider it, at best, a minor contributing possibility, and at worst, an interesting idea without real evidentiary backing. So where does that leave us? Almost certainly, no single explanation acted entirely alone. The strongest, most evidence-backed driver by a significant margin is thermoregulation, tightly connected to the emergence of endurance running and persistence hunting on the open savanna. But parasite avoidance and sexual selection likely added additional, compounding pressure once reduced body hair had already begun appearing in the population, reinforcing a trait that was already being favored for entirely separate physiological reasons. There's one more piece of this story that deserves real attention, because it explains how humans managed to survive the huge remaining problem this transformation created. If you strip away thick body fur to survive brutally hot days on the savanna, you now have a serious new problem the moment the sun goes down and temperatures drop, sometimes dramatically, especially at higher elevations or during colder seasons. Fur isn't only useful for looking intimidating or attracting a mate. It's a genuinely effective insulation system, and losing it creates a dangerous vulnerability to hypothermia during cold nights. This is very likely where fire and clothing enter the picture, not as unrelated cultural inventions that happen to occur around the same time by coincidence, but as the necessary technological replacement for the biological insulation our ancestors were actively losing. Evidence for the controlled use of fire stretches back at least 1 million years, and quite possibly further, roughly overlapping with the same broad window our genetic evidence points to for significant hair loss. Clothing, as we already discussed through the lice evidence, followed sometime after that, likely as body hair had already thinned enough that nighttime cold became a genuinely serious survival threat requiring an artificial solution. In other words, humans didn't just evolve away from fur and hope for the best. We evolved away from fur while simultaneously developing external tools, fire and clothing, that functionally replaced exactly what natural fur used to provide. Biology solved the daytime heat problem by shedding hair and building an extraordinary sweat system. Culture and technology solved the nighttime cold problem that decision created. Neither solution alone would have worked. Together, they made an entirely new kind of hominin possible. One built for covering extraordinary distances under a blazing sun that would have been physically unbearable for almost any other primate on the planet. And this transformation had consequences that rippled forward across the rest of human evolution in ways that go well beyond simply feeling hot or cold. That extraordinary endurance running capability, made possible specifically by our unusually efficient cooling system, likely allowed early humans access to a far wider hunting range, more reliable access to meat and animal fat, and significantly richer, more consistent caloric intake than earlier hominins had access to. And that dramatic increase in available calories is widely considered one of several key factors that allowed the human brain to grow to its current remarkable size over the following 1,000,000+ years, since brain tissue is extraordinarily metabolically expensive to build and maintain. There's a real evidence-supported case to be made that losing our fur wasn't simply a footnote in human evolution. It may have been one of the quiet foundational steps that eventually made everything else, tool use, complex language, culture itself, biologically possible in the first place. So the next time you notice your own bare skin, standing in the shower, feeling a breeze against your arm, sweating through a hot afternoon, you're looking at the direct physical legacy of a hunting strategy your ancestors used more than 1,000,000 years ago. A strategy that traded thick, protective fur for the ability to outlast almost anything else on the savanna simply by refusing to stop moving. A trade that came bundled with new vulnerabilities, cold nights, sunburned skin, that our ancestors then had to solve with fire and clothing, technologies that arguably only exist today because our bodies stopped being able to survive without them. We didn't lose our fur because evolution made a random, careless mistake. We lost it because, somewhere on a scorching stretch of ancient grassland, being able to run something down under the full heat of the midday sun mattered more than staying warm at night ever did. And every single one of us alive today is still wearing the physical proof of that decision, written directly into skin that fur once used to cover.